In the middle of the 20th century, a secret changed the world forever. It began in quiet laboratories, under flickering lights, where scientists uncovered a power greater than anything humanity had ever known. It was a race against time, driven by fear, ambition, and survival. A race to build a weapon so powerful it could end wars or end civilization itself. This is the story of how that weapon was born, a story of science, secrecy, and moral reckoning, a story known to history as the Manhattan Project. In 1938, deep within a small laboratory in Berlin, two German chemists made a discovery that would alter the course of history. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann had managed to split the atom of uranium, a process that released an immense amount of energy. It was the discovery of nuclear fission, the unlocking of power hidden within the heart of matter itself. The scientific implications were profound, but in a world already on the brink of war, the political and military consequences were terrifying. Scientists across Europe quickly realized what this could mean. If such a process could be controlled, it could create a weapon of unimaginable power. Among those who understood the potential was a group of physicists who had fled Nazi persecution. They feared that Germany, under Hitler, might be able to harness this new science first. In the summer of 1939, Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard and his colleague Eugene Wigner approached Albert Einstein, asking him to sign a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The letter warned that Germany could develop an atomic bomb. Einstein agreed, and that letter would become one of the most consequential communications of the 20th century. When Roosevelt read it, he immediately set up a small committee to investigate. That was the seed from which the Manhattan Project would eventually grow. At first, it was not a massive operation. It was a handful of physicists and military officers working quietly on theoretical research and small experiments. Funding was minimal, and most people involved could not have imagined the scale the project would one day reach. But as the Second World War expanded, the stakes grew. Reports from Europe hinted that German scientists were making progress toward a bomb. The United States began to take the idea more seriously. By late 1941, just before America entered the war, a series of committees and subcommittees were already forming to coordinate research on atomic energy. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States entered the war, and the atomic project took on new urgency. In 1942, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers took control of the effort and formed what was officially known as the Manhattan Engineer District. The name came simply from the location of its first offices in Manhattan, New York. Leading the entire operation was Brigadier General Leslie Richard Groves, a tough, practical engineer who had just overseen the construction of the Pentagon. Groves was known for his relentless drive and organizational skill, qualities that would soon be tested to their limits. He chose a theoretical physicist, J. Robert Oppenheimer, as the project's scientific director. Oppenheimer, a brilliant but complex man, would assemble the greatest collection of scientific minds ever brought together for a single purpose. The Manhattan Project was a unique combination of science, engineering, and industrial power. Its goal was simple to describe but nearly impossible to achieve: to produce a working atomic bomb before Germany or Japan could do the same. To accomplish that, the project would have to solve two monumental problems. First, it needed fissile material, uranium-235 or plutonium-239, in quantities large enough to sustain a chain reaction. Second, It had to design and construct a weapon capable of using that material effectively. Both problems required unprecedented effort, resources, and secrecy. To produce fissile material, the United States built entire new cities devoted to atomic production. In Tennessee, near the town of Oak Ridge, the government constructed what was called the Clinton Engineer Works. Its purpose was to enrich uranium, separating the rare uranium-235 isotope from the far more common uranium-238. The methods for doing this, gaseous diffusion, electromagnetic separation, and thermal diffusion, were all experimental and required massive facilities. At its peak, Oak Ridge employed more than 70,000 people, most of whom had no idea what they were actually working on. They operated enormous machines, followed precise instructions, and were told only that their work was vital to the war effort. In Washington state, along the Columbia River, another facility was built at Hanford. This one would produce plutonium by irradiating uranium in large nuclear reactors. These reactors were the first of their kind, designed in secrecy and built at an astonishing pace. Engineers had to invent entirely new techniques to manage heat, radiation, and chemical processing. The Hanford site would eventually produce the plutonium used in the second atomic bomb, the one dropped on Nagasaki. Meanwhile, a third major site was established in the remote high desert of New Mexico at a place called Los Alamos. This was to be the scientific heart of the Manhattan Project, where the design and assembly of the bombs would take place. Oppenheimer handpicked the location himself. It was isolated, secure, and offered enough space for the laboratories, housing, and testing grounds that would be needed. By early 1943, scientists from across America, Britain, and Canada were arriving at Los Alamos. Many of them were among the most brilliant physicists in the world, men like Enrico Fermi, Hans Bethe, Richard Feynman, and Edward Teller. They came from universities, private laboratories, and even the military, bound together by secrecy and the single objective of ending the war through science. Life at Los Alamos was intense and surreal. Scientists lived with their families in a fenced-off community, guarded by soldiers and surrounded by barbed wire. Mail was censored. Movements were restricted. Even within the project, information was compartmentalized. People were told only what they needed to know. Yet the atmosphere was electric with intellectual energy. Experiments ran day and night. Theoretical discussions stretched into the early morning hours. Breakthroughs and failures came in rapid succession. At first, no one was entirely sure what the final weapon would look like. The simplest idea was a gun-type bomb, a device that would fire one piece of uranium into another to achieve critical mass. But uranium-235 was extremely difficult to obtain. The other option, using plutonium, posed new challenges. Plutonium's properties made the gun design impossible. It would pre-detonate before reaching critical mass. That meant a completely new approach was required, one that involved compressing the plutonium into a supercritical state through a precisely timed implosion. Developing that method would take more than 2 years of trial, error, and innovation. As these scientific challenges unfolded, the Manhattan Project grew into one of the largest industrial operations in history. At its peak, it employed more than 120,000 people and cost nearly $2 billion, over $20 billion in today's money. Entire supply chains were created from scratch. Engineers built reactors, chemical separation plants, and new types of measuring instruments. Thousands of tons of uranium ore were mined, refined, and shipped under military guard. Every piece of equipment, every shipment, every person involved was subject to strict secrecy. General Groves enforced that secrecy with military precision. Workers who asked too many questions were reassigned or dismissed. Security clearances were rigorously vetted. Even the scientists at Los Alamos were sometimes frustrated by the restrictions, but they understood the stakes. If Germany developed the bomb first, it could mean victory for the Nazis and disaster for the Allies. The war provided both urgency and justification. Every setback was a threat to victory. Every breakthrough, a step closer to ending global conflict. Yet for all its scale, the project was invisible to the public. Few outside the inner circle of military and scientific leaders even knew it existed. Congress appropriated funds under vague budget categories. Newspapers never reported on it. For most Americans, the atomic bomb would appear as if from nowhere, an unimaginable weapon unleashed without warning. By 1944, the work at Oak Ridge and Hanford was producing results. Enriched uranium began arriving in small quantities, while plutonium production accelerated. At Los Alamos, Oppenheimer's team was now focused on perfecting two bomb designs. The uranium weapon, known as Little Boy, was relatively straightforward, though it still required exact precision in machining and assembly. The plutonium bomb, later called Fat Man, demanded entirely new engineering techniques. Explosives had to detonate with millisecond precision in a perfectly symmetrical pattern to compress the plutonium core evenly. Even the smallest miscalculation would render the weapon a failure. The scientists designed high-speed electronics to synchronize detonations and use new mathematical models to predict how the implosion would behave. They built test devices, conducted countless experiments, and often worked in exhausting conditions. Oppenheimer, thin and intense, moved constantly from lab to lab, encouraging, questioning, and sometimes pushing his colleagues to their limits. The atmosphere at Los Alamos was a strange mix of excitement and dread. The scientists knew they were making history, but they also sensed the gravity of what they were creating. They were racing against time, against their own doubts, and against the terrifying possibility that their enemies were doing the same thing. By the end of 1944, the German atomic program had stalled. Unbeknownst to most of the scientists, Germany had neither the resources nor the coordination to complete a bomb. But in New Mexico, the work continued with full momentum. No one could take the chance of slowing down. The war in the Pacific still raged, and every day brought new casualties. The Manhattan Project had become a vast network of factories, laboratories, and offices spread across the United States and even overseas. It was the most secret enterprise ever undertaken by the U.S. government. Its existence depended on thousands of people keeping silent. Most would never know the true purpose of their work until after the war ended. Inside Los Alamos, the final phase of development was approaching. The theoretical designs were nearly complete, the materials were ready, and the test site had been chosen. Oppenheimer and Groves selected a remote desert area in southern New Mexico, called the Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of the Dead Man. It was an appropriate name for what was about to happen there. The world was only months away from witnessing the first nuclear explosion in history. By early 1945, the Manhattan Project had reached the edge of completion. The materials were ready, the designs finalized, and the war in the Pacific was far from over. Every day the death toll climbed higher, and the pressure on the scientists and the military intensified. Months of calculations, failures, and breakthroughs were now converging on a single moment. The weapon that had only existed in theory would soon become a terrifying reality. The desert chosen for the test was a remote stretch of land in southern New Mexico, far from towns or cities. It was called the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, a name that seemed to foreshadow what was to come. The test itself was given the code name Trinity. Oppenheimer had chosen it himself, inspired by a poem by John Donne. The final device, a plutonium implosion bomb, was assembled under the utmost secrecy. It was a dense metal sphere surrounded by carefully arranged layers of high explosives, detonators, and intricate wiring. It had been built piece by piece at Los Alamos, transported under armed guard, and reassembled on site. The entire process was carried out with precision bordering on obsession. Everyone understood that even the smallest mistake could destroy months of work, or worse, cause a catastrophic accident. In the early hours of July 16, 1945, scientists, soldiers, and technicians gathered in bunkers miles from the test tower. The bomb was hoisted to the top of a steel structure 100 feet high. Instruments surrounded the area, ready to record light, heat, and radiation. The sky was still dark, a faint wind blowing across the desert. At 5:29 and 45 seconds in the morning, the world entered the atomic age. A blinding flash lit the landscape as if the sun had exploded on Earth. The shock wave rolled outward, flattening everything within miles. A column of fire rose into the sky, forming the first mushroom cloud ever seen. The light was so bright that witnesses more than 200 miles away could see it. Those who watched from the bunkers were struck silent. No one had truly known what to expect. Some feared the atmosphere itself might ignite. Others thought the test might fail entirely. But as the rumble faded and the fireball lifted into the sky, they realized that humanity had crossed a threshold that could never be reversed. In that moment, Oppenheimer remembered a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." For him and many others, the success of the test brought both triumph and dread. They had proven that the weapon worked, but they also understood what it meant. The power they had unleashed was no longer theoretical. It was real, and it would soon be used. General Leslie Groves, ever the soldier, was already thinking ahead. The bomb had to be delivered, deployed, and ready to end the war. 2 bombs had been built in parallel. The first, the uranium bomb, used a simpler gun-type design and was nicknamed Little Boy. The second, the plutonium bomb, was based on the complex implosion method tested at Trinity and was called Fat Man. Each weapon represented years of work, billions of dollars, and the combined effort of more than 100,000 people spread across multiple sites. Once the Trinity test confirmed success, the decision to use them was no longer hypothetical. In Washington, President Harry S. Truman, who had taken office after the death of Franklin Roosevelt, faced an impossible choice. The war in Europe was over, but Japan continued to resist. The Japanese military had shown no sign of surrender, even in the face of devastating conventional bombing. Invasion plans projected catastrophic casualties on both sides. The bomb promised a way to end the war swiftly, but at a terrible human cost. After consultation with military advisors, Truman approved the use of atomic weapons against Japan, The targets would be cities with military importance and minimal prisoner of war camps. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were selected. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay took off from the island of Tinian. On board was Little Boy, the world's first uranium-based atomic bomb. The crew had been briefed, but even they could not fully comprehend the weapon they carried. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb was released over Hiroshima. It detonated approximately 600 meters above the city, producing a blast equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. In less than 1 second, Hiroshima was engulfed in a fireball hotter than the surface of the sun. Within minutes, more than 70,000 people were dead. Thousands more were injured, burned, or trapped under collapsing buildings. Fires raged uncontrollably, and a black rain of radioactive ash began to fall. The city was gone. Where streets and homes had once stood, there was now a wasteland of ash and twisted steel. The news reached Washington within hours. The weapon had performed exactly as predicted. Truman announced to the world that the United States had used a new kind of bomb, one of unprecedented destructive power. He warned Japan that continued resistance would lead to further devastation. Yet even after the horror of Hiroshima, Japan did not immediately surrender. The Japanese leadership was divided, torn between surrender and defiance. The Allies waited only 3 days before sending another message, this time to the city of Nagasaki. On August 9th, a second bomber, Boxcar, carried the plutonium bomb, Fat Man. The primary target had been Kokura, but heavy cloud cover forced the crew to divert to the secondary target. At 11 o'clock in the morning, the bomb exploded over Nagasaki. Its yield was even greater than the first, around 21,000 tons of TNT. The blast flattened the Urakami Valley, destroyed factories, and vaporized entire neighborhoods. Approximately 40,000 people were killed instantly. Another 40,000 would die in the following months from burns, radiation, and injuries. Once again, the unimaginable had become reality. The combined devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki broke Japan's resistance. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people, announcing Japan's surrender. It was the first time a Japanese emperor had ever spoken directly to the public. The Second World War was over. The Manhattan Project had achieved its purpose. But the victory came at a price that would haunt generations. The images of the destroyed cities, the burned survivors, and the endless suffering became permanent reminders of what nuclear weapons could do. Back in America, the scientists and workers who had labored in secrecy for years began to learn the results of their efforts. For many, the realization was devastating. They had believed their work was necessary to stop Nazi Germany, not to annihilate entire cities of civilians. Some were proud that their work had ended the war. Others were filled with guilt and sorrow. In Los Alamos, the news of Hiroshima spread quickly. Oppenheimer walked through the laboratory shaken. Some scientists celebrated, others cried. He later met with President Truman, telling him he felt he had blood on his hands. Truman, focused on victory and politics, dismissed him. Their relationship would never recover. As the world absorbed the reality of atomic warfare, the scale of the Manhattan Project began to emerge. In total, the project had cost about $2 billion, involved more than 130,000 people, and stretched across sites in more than 30 states. The secrecy had been absolute. Even Vice President Truman had not known of its existence until he became president. The project had proven that a nation could marshal its scientific and industrial power on an unprecedented scale when driven by war. It had also proven that science, once unleashed, could no longer be contained by conscience alone. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, known as hibakusha, carried the physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives. Radiation sickness, cancer, and birth defects plagued the population for decades. The long-term effects of exposure shocked the scientific community. Doctors and researchers from around the world studied the victims, seeking to understand what nuclear energy did to the human body. Their findings laid the foundation for future radiation medicine and safety standards, but they also served as a grim record of suffering. In Japan, the ruins of Hiroshima became a symbol of peace and remembrance. The Peace Memorial Park was built where the bomb had detonated, with a simple inscription that read, "Let all the souls here rest in peace, for we shall not repeat the evil." But even as the world mourned, a new chapter of history was beginning. The power revealed by the Manhattan Project could not be forgotten. Nations across the globe began to race to control it. In the months following the war, the United States government attempted to manage the legacy of its creation. The project was dismantled as a wartime operation, but its facilities continued under new names and new purposes. Oak Ridge shifted to research and nuclear energy. Hanford continued to produce plutonium for military stockpiles. Los Alamos remained a laboratory of innovation, now working on more advanced weapons. The age of nuclear secrecy had begun, and the Manhattan Project had become the blueprint for all that followed. While the world celebrated peace, the scientists who had built the bomb faced a different kind of war, a moral one. They had opened a door that could never be closed. The weapon that had ended one war had begun another. One fought not with armies, but with fear, politics, and power. The atomic age had arrived, and humanity was only beginning to understand what it had created. When the war ended in August of 1945, the United States stood as the only nation on Earth possessing atomic weapons. The images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki spread quickly across the world, and the reactions were mixed. There was awe at the scale of destruction, pride in the achievement, fear of what might come next, and a deep unease that humanity had crossed a line it could never retreat from. The atomic bomb had not only ended a global war, it had ended an age. The age before nuclear power, before the knowledge that civilization could destroy itself in a single act. For the people who had built the bomb, the victory was hollow. The scientists and engineers who had labored for years in secret began to face the reality of what they had done. They had been driven by fear that Nazi Germany might build the bomb first. When the war ended in Europe and Germany was defeated, many believed their work would be stopped. Instead, the bomb was used on Japan. For Oppenheimer and many of his colleagues, that realization changed everything. What had begun as a race for survival had become a question of morality. In the months that followed, the United States struggled to decide what to do with its new power. The military wanted to expand the nuclear program. Politicians debated control and secrecy. Scientists argued over ethics and the future of atomic research. The Manhattan Project had been run entirely under military supervision. General Groves wanted to keep it that way, convinced that national security required total control. Oppenheimer and others disagreed. They believed atomic energy should be governed by civilians, used for science, medicine, and peace, not just weapons. That debate led to the creation of the Atomic Energy Commission in 1946. Control of nuclear research was transferred from the Army to a new civilian agency. The change marked the beginning of the atomic age. Laboratories like Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford continued their work, but now, under a new banner. The mission expanded beyond weapon production to include energy generation, medicine, and fundamental research. Yet even as the focus shifted, the specter of the bomb remained. The atomic bomb had demonstrated to every nation on Earth that military power no longer depended on armies alone. It depended on science, technology, and information. Other countries began to pursue their own nuclear programs. Britain, which had contributed to the Manhattan Project through its tube alloys program, resumed its independent efforts after the war. Canada continued research into reactor technology. And in the Soviet Union, a massive secret program began, aided by intelligence gathered from spies inside the Manhattan Project. The balance of power was already changing. The Soviet effort was driven by a mixture of fear and ambition. Joseph Stalin had learned of the Manhattan Project through espionage long before the United States publicly revealed the bomb. Soviet physicists, led by Igor Kurchatov, began working to replicate the weapon as quickly as possible. The intelligence provided by spies like Klaus Fuchs, who had worked at Los Alamos, proved invaluable. In August 1949, just 4 years after Hiroshima, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic bomb at a test site in Kazakhstan. The monopoly was broken. The Cold War had begun. In America, the news of the Soviet test shocked the government and the public. It shattered the illusion of security that had come with being the sole nuclear power. President Truman responded by authorizing the development of a new weapon, far more powerful than the bombs used in Japan. It would use fusion instead of fission, harnessing the same process that powers the sun, the hydrogen bomb. The scientists were divided again. Some, like Edward Teller, believed it was necessary to stay ahead of the Soviets. Others, including Oppenheimer, argued that such weapons would make war unthinkable. But fear and politics carried the day. The United States began work on the hydrogen bomb in 1950. 3 years later, it was successfully tested in the Pacific, releasing energy equivalent to 10 million tons of TNT. The era of thermonuclear weapons had begun. The Cold War that followed was defined by tension, secrecy, and the constant threat of annihilation. Both superpowers built arsenals of unimaginable size. They developed intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear submarines, and bombers capable of striking anywhere in the world. The principle of deterrence, the belief that mutual destruction would prevent war, became the fragile foundation of peace. For the first time in history, humanity possessed the ability to end itself completely. Every political crisis, every confrontation between nations, carried the risk of escalation that could destroy civilization. While governments and generals planned for the unthinkable, scientists continued to push the boundaries of nuclear research. The same knowledge that had produced weapons also brought advances in energy and medicine. Reactors built for plutonium production were adapted to generate electricity. Radioisotopes were used for cancer treatment and medical imaging. The Manhattan Project had given birth to technologies that could both heal and destroy. The dual nature of atomic energy became the central paradox of the 20th century. The original Manhattan Project sites transformed in the post-war years. Oak Ridge became a center for nuclear research and later for energy production. Hanford continued producing plutonium, feeding the expanding American stockpile throughout the Cold War. Los Alamos remained at the forefront of weapons development, evolving into one of the world's leading research laboratories. The secrecy that had once surrounded the project continued, though in a new form. Entire generations of scientists worked behind locked gates, advancing technologies whose full purpose was known only to a few. The environmental consequences of these efforts were immense. At Hanford, liquid radioactive waste was pumped into the ground and stored in tanks that would later leak. Oak Ridge released contaminated water and chemicals into nearby rivers. The Trinity test site remained irradiated for decades. The pursuit of nuclear power had left scars on the land that would take centuries to heal. For many workers, the danger had been invisible. They had inhaled plutonium dust, handled uranium without protection, and lived near reactors that leaked radiation. Years later, cancers and genetic damage appeared. The Manhattan Project had changed not only history, but also the environment and the bodies of those who served it. The scientists who had built the bomb faced another kind of fallout, moral and political. In the early 1950s, Oppenheimer's opposition to the hydrogen bomb and his outspoken views on international control of atomic energy brought him into conflict with the US government. During the height of the Red Scare, he was accused of disloyalty and stripped of his security clearance. The man who had led the most secret scientific project in history was now branded a risk. His fall from grace was both personal and symbolic. The scientist who had given America the bomb was cast out by the very government he had served. It marked the end of an era when idealism and science could coexist without suspicion. The Manhattan Project had started as a wartime emergency, but it had evolved into something far larger, a permanent institution of science, secrecy, and power. It showed how nations could mobilize knowledge for survival, but also how easily that knowledge could be used for domination. Every nuclear test, every political crisis, every arms race that followed traced its origin back to the laboratories and deserts of the Manhattan Project. Meanwhile, the rest of the world struggled with the new reality. Britain tested its first bomb in 1952. France followed in 1960. China entered the nuclear club in 1964. The technology that had once been confined to a handful of American and British scientists now spread across continents. Efforts to control it began early. The United Nations established the International Atomic Energy Agency to monitor peaceful uses of nuclear technology. Treaties were signed to limit testing, restrict proliferation, and reduce stockpiles. Yet the shadow of the Manhattan Project loomed over all of it. The knowledge could not be unlearned. The weapon could not be uninvented. In the United States, public attitudes toward atomic power shifted repeatedly. In the 1950s, the government promoted nuclear energy as a symbol of progress. Atoms for peace became a slogan of optimism. Power plants were built, research reactors installed at universities, and nuclear medicine expanded rapidly. But accidents and environmental damage slowly changed perceptions. The promise of clean, limitless energy came with the same danger that had haunted the Manhattan Project: human error, secrecy, and the ever-present risk of catastrophe. By the 1960s, the atomic bomb had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of both fear and fascination, popular culture filled with images of mushroom clouds and apocalyptic visions. Films, books, and art reflected the unease of living in a nuclear world. The names of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Los Alamos became part of collective memory, reminders of both triumph and tragedy. The Manhattan Project had proven that science could solve problems once thought impossible. It had also proven that power without restraint could threaten the very existence of humanity. In the laboratories of Los Alamos, scientists had dreamed of splitting atoms. They succeeded, and in doing so, they split history itself into a before and an after. Nothing would ever be the same again. By the end of the 1960s, nuclear weapons numbered in the tens of thousands. Each one was capable of leveling a city. Generals and politicians spoke calmly of megatons and payloads, while ordinary people practiced hiding under desks. The scale of destruction became abstract, a matter of numbers instead of lives. The same secrecy that had protected the Manhattan Project now hid the full extent of the global arsenal. Humanity had entered an age where knowledge itself was dangerous. Yet, amid the fear, there were voices of reflection. Scientists, religious leaders, and survivors of Hiroshima began to speak out, calling for restraint, for peace, for an end to nuclear testing. Their pleas reached some ears, but the momentum of the arms race continued. The same drive that had once built the bomb to end a war now kept building more to prevent another. The logic was circular, the fear self-sustaining. The Manhattan Project had begun as a desperate response to tyranny, a scientific race against time. It ended as a permanent condition of human existence, a balance of power maintained by the threat of total destruction. The men and women who created it had believed they were fighting to save the world. In some ways, they had. But they also ensured that the world would never again feel truly safe. Through the 1970s and 80s, the legacy of the Manhattan Project continued to shape the world. The atomic bomb had transformed from a secret weapon into the foundation of global strategy. Every major power built its foreign policy around the existence of nuclear arms. Diplomacy, economics, and warfare were now conducted under the constant shadow of potential annihilation. The same scientific project that had been born in secrecy in the deserts of New Mexico now determined the fate of nations. By this time, the scale of the world's nuclear stockpile had reached staggering proportions. The United States and the Soviet Union each possessed thousands of warheads mounted on missiles that could cross continents in minutes. Submarines carried them beneath the oceans, bombers circled in the skies, and hidden silos were ready at a moment's notice. The idea that peace could be maintained by the fear of mutual destruction became a permanent doctrine. The phrase mutually assured destruction entered the political vocabulary. It was a grim balance, one that depended on rational leaders, accurate technology, and sheer luck. Behind the scenes, both superpowers sought ways to control this perilous balance. Negotiations led to a series of arms control agreements. The Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963 prohibited atmospheric nuclear testing. The Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968 committed signatory nations to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. Later, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks sought to cap the number of missiles and warheads. Each treaty was a small step toward stability, but none could erase the reality that the weapons existed. They were the children of the Manhattan Project, and their lineage could not be denied. Even as the world tried to control the bomb, new nations entered the nuclear club. India conducted its first successful test in 1974, calling it a peaceful nuclear explosion. Pakistan followed decades later. Israel developed nuclear capability in secret. South Africa briefly joined the ranks before dismantling its arsenal. The dream of keeping the atom confined to peaceful uses proved impossible. Knowledge had spread beyond borders, and once learned, it could not be forgotten. While governments argued over deterrence and treaties, the scientific legacy of the Manhattan Project took other forms. The reactors designed to produce plutonium became the blueprint for civilian nuclear power plants. Scientists who had once worked on weapons turned their skills to medicine, physics, and energy research. Hospitals began using radiation to treat cancer. Power plants promised electricity without smoke or coal. Nuclear submarines explored the oceans, and spacecraft powered by nuclear energy traveled beyond the planets. The same principles that had leveled cities now illuminated homes and cured diseases. It was proof of both the potential and the peril of human invention. But even these peaceful applications were not free of risk. Accidents at nuclear power plants reminded the world that atomic energy demanded perfect control. In 1979, a partial meltdown at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania brought fear to the United States. 7 years later, in 1986, a reactor exploded at Chernobyl in the Soviet Union, spreading radioactive contamination across Europe. The disaster revealed the fragility of the systems that claimed to master the atom. Entire cities were evacuated, and thousands suffered radiation exposure. The promise of safe, clean nuclear energy seemed to vanish in clouds of radioactive dust. The roots of all this lay in the Manhattan Project. It had taught humanity how to split the atom, but not how to live with the consequences. The project had shown that science could solve the hardest problems when driven by urgency. But it also showed that progress without reflection carried a heavy price. The secrecy that had protected the project during the war became the model for government research in the Cold War. Laboratories operated behind locked gates. Information was classified by default. Entire industries grew around the management of secrecy. What began as a wartime necessity became a permanent feature of modern life. At Los Alamos, the birthplace of the bomb, generations of scientists followed in Oppenheimer's footsteps. They designed new weapons, studied nuclear physics, and developed tools for defense and space exploration. Yet the ghost of the original project was always present. The same laboratories that produced the bombs of the Cold War also studied how to dismantle them. The knowledge could create or destroy. The choice depended on who used it. At Oak Ridge, reactors continued to produce isotopes for medicine and research. Hanford, once a symbol of wartime triumph, became one of the most contaminated sites in the world, a reminder that technological power always leaves a footprint. In the broader world, the legacy of the bomb shaped culture as deeply as it shaped politics. Writers, filmmakers, and artists wrestled with its meaning. Movies showed cities consumed by fire. Novels imagined post-apocalyptic wastelands. The mushroom cloud became an icon of both fear and fascination. Children grew up practicing atomic drills in schools, hiding under desks that could never protect them. The bomb was everywhere, unseen yet ever present, woven into the fabric of modern consciousness. For the scientists who had lived through it, the passage of time did not dull the memory. Many spent their later years advocating for disarmament, haunted by what they had helped create. Robert Oppenheimer died in 1967, his reputation partially restored, but his spirit marked by regret. Enrico Fermi, the brilliant Italian physicist whose experiments had made nuclear chain reactions possible, died young, before he could see how far the science had gone. Edward Teller lived long enough to witness the full span of the nuclear era, from its birth to its uneasy maturity, still convinced that deterrence was the only way to preserve peace. As the Cold War entered its final decades, the world learned to live uneasily with the bomb. Each generation inherited a world balanced between destruction and restraint. The political rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union reached its height during crises like Cuba in 1962, when the world came within hours of nuclear war. The leaders on both sides looked into the abyss and stepped back. That moment, more than any other, revealed the truth that the Manhattan Project had forced upon humanity, that the power to destroy the world was now in human hands, and survival depended on reason, not force. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it marked the end of the Cold War, but not the end of the bomb. Nuclear weapons remained in arsenals across the globe. Treaties reduced numbers, but never eliminated them. The same fears persisted in new forms: terrorism, rogue states, accidental launches. The invention born in the deserts of New Mexico had reshaped history so completely that even peace could not escape its shadow. Yet, amid the danger, the scientific spirit that had driven the Manhattan Project continued to evolve. The techniques developed during the project laid the groundwork for modern computing, materials, science, and particle physics. The methods used to model explosions became tools for climate research and astrophysics. The collaboration between scientists, engineers, and governments during the project became the blueprint for space exploration and global scientific cooperation. What began as a secret wartime race became the seed of the information age. Over the decades, the sites of the Manhattan Project changed from restricted zones to historical landmarks. At Los Alamos, visitors now walk through the same mesa where Oppenheimer once stood, looking out over the desert. At Oak Ridge, the massive facilities that once enriched uranium now serve as museums and research centers. Hanford, once a fortress of secrecy, is being cleaned and preserved as a monument to the age of the atom. These places remind us of both the brilliance and the burden of human discovery. The true legacy of the Manhattan Project is not just the bomb. It is the revelation that knowledge itself is power, and that power always comes with a price. The scientists of the project were not monsters or heroes, but human beings caught in extraordinary circumstances. They believed they were saving civilization, and in many ways they did. But they also unleashed forces that no one fully understood. Every time a reactor hums, every time a missile sits in its silo, every time a city lights up from nuclear power, the echo of the Manhattan Project can still be felt. Even now, as nations debate disarmament and energy policy, the lessons remain. The world learned that secrecy can protect and corrupt, that science can liberate and destroy, and that progress without humility can lead to ruin. The Manhattan Project was more than a scientific milestone. It was a mirror held up to humanity's greatest strengths and deepest flaws. It showed what we are capable of when united by purpose, and what we risk when driven by fear. The story of the Manhattan Project is the story of the modern world, a story of intellect, ambition, secrecy, and consequence. From the first fission experiment in a small Berlin laboratory to the roar of the bomb over the New Mexico desert, it traces the journey of a species that learned how to split the atom, and in doing so, discovered both its genius and its fragility. The bomb ended a war, but it also began an age where the survival of the world depends on wisdom as much as strength. As the 21st century began, the legacy of the Manhattan Project remained deeply woven into every aspect of modern life. More than half a century had passed since the first atomic bomb had exploded in the New Mexico desert, yet the consequences of that moment continued to shape nations, science, and society. The laboratories born from the project still existed, transformed but never entirely separated from their origins. Los Alamos stood on its mesa in New Mexico, now a vast research center, studying everything from supercomputing to climate modeling. Oak Ridge in Tennessee continued to operate as a hub of advanced energy research and materials science. Hanford, long decommissioned, was still being cleaned, its vast tanks of radioactive waste a silent testimony to the cost of the nuclear age. The governments that once fought to possess the atom now struggled to control it. Nuclear weapons had become currency in the world of power. Some nations guarded them as deterrents. Others sought them for protection or prestige. The threat of nuclear terrorism emerged, the fear that stolen material or knowledge could bring the devastation of Hiroshima to any modern city. Treaties multiplied, promising limits, inspections, and transparency. Yet suspicion always remained. The knowledge created by the Manhattan Project could never be unlearned. It had escaped the laboratories, entered universities, industries, and the black markets of the world. What had begun as a top-secret wartime program had become part of human civilization itself. At the same time, nuclear technology quietly transformed medicine and energy. Hospitals used radiation to diagnose disease and to treat cancers that had once been untreatable. Research reactors produced isotopes for agriculture and industry. Nuclear power plants supplied a significant share of electricity to the developed world. For decades, nuclear energy had promised a future free from pollution and dependence on fossil fuels. But each promise came with risk. Accidents at places like Chernobyl and later Fukushima reminded the world that the atom's power could never be fully tamed. A single failure, a single miscalculation could turn progress into catastrophe. In the cultural memory of the world, the Manhattan Project became both legend and warning. Historians studied it as the ultimate example of scientific cooperation and governmental mobilization. Artists saw it as a symbol of human ambition and tragedy. The image of the mushroom cloud became one of the defining icons of the modern era, representing not victory, but vulnerability. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki aged and passed their stories to younger generations, their testimonies becoming the conscience of a world still armed to the teeth. Each anniversary brought reflection, ceremonies of peace, and renewed debate about whether the bombings had been necessary or justified. There were no easy answers, only enduring questions. Inside the laboratories, the spirit of scientific discovery endured. Physicists who once built weapons turned their attention to understanding the universe itself. The same principles that had governed atomic fission now guided experiments in particle accelerators and quantum research. The computing systems invented to model explosions evolved into the supercomputers that mapped genomes and simulated galaxies. From tragedy and fear had grown technology that expanded human knowledge beyond imagination. Yet even amid progress, the shadow remained. Every breakthrough in energy or physics carried echoes of Los Alamos, reminders that knowledge is never neutral. It can illuminate or destroy, depending on the hand that wields it. Governments attempted to reckon with the moral legacy. Declassified documents revealed the extent of secrecy and experimentation during the Manhattan Project years. People exposed to radiation without consent, soldiers used in tests, civilians relocated without explanation. Each story added another layer to the understanding of what the race for the bomb had cost. Compensation programs began, but no payment could undo what had been done. The project's moral debt extended beyond borders and generations. The new century brought new challenges. Rogue states tested weapons, and global tension returned. Satellites tracked missile launches, and leaders spoke again of deterrence. But unlike the early Cold War, the danger was diffuse. The line between civilian and military nuclear technology blurred. A reactor could produce power, or fuel for a bomb. Nations faced the same dilemma Oppenheimer had faced decades before. Could they control what they had created? Could they trust that others would do the same? Meanwhile, public opinion shifted once more toward nuclear energy as the world confronted climate change. Scientists argued that atomic power, properly managed, offered the only reliable path to a carbon-neutral future. The debate echoed the old arguments of the 1940s and 50s. Hope and fear intertwined, progress shadowed by risk. Each new reactor, each new research facility was both a step forward and a reminder of the past. Through all of this, the story of the Manhattan Project remained the foundation. It was the blueprint for how science and government could combine in moments of crisis. It demonstrated the speed, the discipline, and the sheer ingenuity that human beings could muster when survival was at stake. It also demonstrated how easily moral boundaries could blur when urgency replaced reflection. The world built from that project was richer, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. The ether scientists who had lived to see the 21st century often spoke of their work with humility. They knew that history would never simplify their legacy into good or evil. The Manhattan Project had created tools that could defend freedom or erase it. The bomb had ended one war and started another, an invisible one fought in mines and laboratories rather than on battlefields. Every new discovery in physics, every leap in technology, carried the memory of those years when the first chain reaction burned bright beneath the stands of a football field in Chicago, and when a desert dawn turned into a sun. The Manhattan Project no longer exists as an organization, but its influence flows through nearly every corner of modern civilization. The digital world was built on computing advances born from its calculations. Modern medicine grew from its radiological research. The structure of classified research, the relationship between science and the state, and the ethical codes that guide modern laboratories all trace their lineage to that project. It was a beginning disguised as an ending. Across the world, historians continue to uncover documents and testimonies, piecing together the hidden layers of the project. Each discovery reveals the immense scale of what was achieved and the quiet sacrifices made to achieve it. Entire towns had vanished into secrecy, Thousands of workers had lived their lives behind fences, never knowing the full purpose of their labor. When the war ended, they returned to ordinary lives, carrying secrets they could never discuss. Their stories emerged only decades later, when the classification seals were broken. They became the forgotten foundation of a technological revolution. In universities, students study the equations of nuclear physics without realizing they are walking paths first charted under wartime pressure. The names of the pioneers, Fermi, Szilard, Bethe, Teller, Oppenheimer, still appear in textbooks, stripped of the moral complexity that defined them in life. To many young scientists, they are historical figures. To those who remember, they remain human beings who faced the most impossible question science has ever posed. Not how to do something, but whether to do it at all. The debate over nuclear weapons and energy has not ended. Nations still hold arsenals capable of ending the world many times over. Yet the most profound impact of the Manhattan Project may be psychological. Humanity learned that it could command the forces of the universe, and that such command came with fear. For the first time, the species that had harnessed fire and electricity now possessed the power of the stars. The atom became a mirror reflecting human nature itself, showing both genius and recklessness, compassion and cruelty. As the generations who lived through the atomic dawn pass away, memory fades into history. Museums preserve the artifacts, the blueprints, the Geiger counters, the fragments of metal from the Trinity Tower. Visitors walk through exhibitions, listening to recordings of voices long gone, describing the blinding light, the heat, and the silence that followed. Outside those walls, life continues. Cars move, cities glow at night, satellites orbit above, powered by descendants of that same technology. The world runs on the inheritance of the Manhattan Project, whether it acknowledges it or not. In recent years, new technologies, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, quantum computing, have been compared to the discovery of the atom. Each promises extraordinary progress and carries terrifying risks. The lessons of the Manhattan Project return again and again. That scientific achievement without ethical foresight leads to consequences no one can predict or control. The pattern is familiar: excitement, secrecy, discovery, and the sudden realization of danger. History repeats, not because people forget, but because they believe the new frontier will be different. The story of the Manhattan Project warns otherwise. In the deserts of New Mexico, the Trinity site still exists. Once a restricted military area, it opens to visitors twice a year. They walk across the plain where the first atomic fire rose into the sky, looking at the glassy sand fused by the heat of that explosion. The air is still, the landscape vast, and the silence heavy. It is impossible to stand there without imagining the moment when the world changed. The place feels both ancient and eternal, as if time itself paused there for a fraction of a second when the atom split and history began again. From that moment forward, everything humanity has done has carried an echo of that light. The power of the atom became the measure of what humans could achieve and of what they must avoid. Every satellite launched, every medical scan performed, every debate about power and ethics traces back to that morning in 1945. The Manhattan Project was not simply a chapter in history. It was the turning point between the old world and the new. And so the story continues, The laboratories hum, the reactors glow, the missiles sleep in silos, and the survivors tell their stories one last time. The question the Manhattan Project began to ask has never been answered. It waits in every discovery and every invention that follows. Now that humanity has the power of creation and destruction in its own hands, what will it choose to do with it? The story of the Manhattan Project is not just about the birth of a weapon. It is about what happens when human curiosity meets power without limits. It is about the brilliance of minds that reached beyond what anyone thought possible, and the weight that came with their discovery. From the laboratories of Los Alamos to the ruins of Hiroshima, from the silence of the desert to the noise of a world forever changed, its shadow still stretches across time. We live today in the world the Manhattan Project created, a world where science can save or destroy, where knowledge is power and power demands wisdom. The people who built the bomb are gone, but the questions they faced remain. How much should we know? How far should we go? And when does progress become danger? The answer, perhaps, is not in the science, but in ourselves. The Manhattan Project showed us what we are capable of when we unite for a purpose. It also showed us how fragile that purpose can be. The light that flashed over the New Mexico desert was more than the birth of a bomb. It was the birth of an age, the age of responsibility. This is the unknown zone. Thank you for listening.